By radio, the lifeboat heard that a rubber life raft with 5 men aboard had broken adrift and been swept away from the trawler, leaving 9 men on board. As the lifeboat approached the little skerry, the wreck could be seen lying bows to the west and broadside to the shore, and heeled over to 40 degrees. She appeared in imminent danger of capsizing as she was pounded by the heavy seas. The mechanics throttled back to half speed and the lifeboat eased close into the rocks to assess the position. Tidal eddies and confused breaking seas made conditions very dangerous. The lifeboat closed the wreck and hove to only 20 yards to windward, preparing to go alongside. And then a huge wave came up astern, lifted the lifeboat and swept her broadside towards the wreck at tremendous speed. The cox ordered full astern, and from only a few feet from the wreck, the lifeboat clawed off stern first into the seas. Only the excellent design of the lifeboat and the expert handling by her crew prevented her from being thrown onto the wreck. The 30-foot high wave rolled 10 foot deep over the Ben Barvas's rails. The coxswain immediately decided that it was impossible to get alongside and that the surf buoy must be used instead. The lifeboat hauled off upwind and across the tide as thick, heavy clouds reduced visibility and it became very dark. About 250 yards to windward, the anchor was dropped to veer the lifeboat down towards the wreck with the wind and the tide. When some 30 yards from the wreck, the cable was secured and the lifeboat lay stern towards the wreck with the wind on her starboard bow and the tide on her beam, tending to sweep her away from the wreck. The cox decided to rig a nylon line to the wreck to hold the lifeboat against the tide and keep her off the southeast reef, as shown in this model. With the anchor in position, a rocket line was fired across the trawler, and a nylon rope or warp passed over and made fast to her upper deck aft. The lifeboat rolled and pitched as the second coxswain fired the line to the wreck. The coxswain mechanics endeavored to keep the lifeboat in position as visibility varied continually with the passing squalls and clouds. A second nylon line was joined on to give sufficient slack, and then, by means of the engines and capstan, the lifeboat was held in the best position. A second rocket was then fired, as shown in the model, for a pulley block to be passed over and secured and the surf buoy then to be rigged. The second line was successfully fired and drawn over to the wreck. The scrambling nets were rigged amidships. The pulley block and surf buoy lines were quickly secured to the light line and drawn over to the trawler and secured, following instructions over the lifeboat's loud hailer. While the surf buoy was being prepared for passing to the wreck, the nylon warp from the lifeboat to wreck stranded and nearly parted and had to be resecured. A difficult job with cold, wet ropes, a heaving deck and seas continually breaking over the lifeboat, but speed was essential, for seas were breaking right over the Ben Barvas, and her hatches, well battened down, had now been forced off. With her heavy list to port, the trawler's rails were sometimes above the sea and sometimes 10 foot under the waves. The Ben Barvas' position was now serious indeed, and her crew could not last much longer. To pull a man through heavy seas is exhausting and dangerous, and the 9 men to be rescued would have to be pulled against the tide, which would carry them after the lifeboat before they could be pulled in amidships and taken on board. But the lives of the 9 men depended on the flimsy surf buoy and its single rope. And here, as he is pulled through the swirling water, the survivor is helpless. He can only hang grimly onto the surf buoy, hoping that his numbed fingers will keep their grip. He catches glimpses of the heaving lifeboat as he gasps and plunges up and down in the sea. On the lifeboat, 2 of the crew manned the outhaul forward, second coxswain and another member of the crew on the inhaul amidships. Another member tended the cable and warp. The mechanics were on the controls and radio, and the cox on the helm and in command. The survivors were drawn into the lee of the lifeboat amidships, pulled aboard, and passed into the after cabin. It was heavy work for the lifeboatmen, pulling the survivors through the heavy sea against the strong tide. A job that could not be hurried, a job requiring skill and patience and strength. And for the survivors, battling for breath in the surf, hope and confidence. People ashore listened anxiously for news on their shortwave receivers. After the second survivor had been taken off, the trawler's fuel tanks ruptured and evil-smelling diesel oil poured out, making deck and ropes extremely slippery, and the task of drawing in the surf buoy even. The scrambling nets were of the greatest assistance in preventing the men from being drawn under the lifeboat. Only 60 feet of murderous sea and surf separated the survivors from safety, but the Barvas was settling by the head, and the lifeboat crew worked desperately as they feared that the wreck might roll over at any time. In the heavy swell, one of the survivors fell down behind the trawler's rail, and a second attempt was made before he was drawn off again on the next wave. And the coxswain was constantly worried lest his anchor should lose its grip or the nylon warp should break. But careful handling of the engines and the capstan eased the strain. The last man to come off was the skipper, and as he left the wreck, he was pounded by heavy seas, and 2 of his ribs were broken. But although in great pain, he managed to hold on to the surf buoy. And finally, the skipper was drawn onto the lifeboat. It had taken a full hour to get the survivors off, but another great battle with the sea had been won. And as the lifeboat sent her report to the Coast Guard, the good news was heard in dozens of homes ashore. Thick clouds added to the gathering darkness as the warp was cut and the lifeboat swung clear. The whole crew had shown exceptionally fine seamanship, for not once during the whole operation had the lines of the surf buoy fouled, and the expert handling of the engines had kept the lifeboat in steady position against the racing tide between the reefs. But getting a lifeboat away from a wreck can be as dangerous as getting her in alongside, and continued vigilance was necessary as the cable was drawn in and the engines used to trip out the anchor to prevent the lifeboat from being caught broadside on by successive heavy seas and capsized. With the anchor finally secured and the deck cleared of ropes, the lifeboat made contact with another trawler, the Ben Screel, which, by good fortune, had picked up the 5 men in the drifting life raft. These too were transferred to the lifeboat. Hot drinks were provided from the emergency stores, and without a doubt these, and the warmth of the cabin heater, greatly helped in the survival of the shipwrecked men, for all were ill from swallowing diesel oil and suffering from shock and exposure. And so, through heavy seas, the lifeboat sailed home, having added 9 more lives to the total of over 550 lives saved by the Long Hope Lifeboat Station. Her crew had carried out a magnificent service, a service which won for each member of the crew the thanks of the Lifeboat Institution inscribed on vellum, and for coxswain Dan Kirkpatrick, the 2nd silver medal for gallantry.